Welcome to the deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Today we are diving into a book that a listener shared with us, Christopher Barnatt's 25 Things You Need to Know About the Future.
Yeah,
And just skimming through this thing, it is chock full of really fascinating ideas.
it is. Yeah,
It's a really, I don't know, intriguing look into the future and kind of a look at a bunch of potential like aha moments. I mean, the scope of this book is really, really remarkable.
it is. It's remarkably comprehensive, covers a really impressive range, from kind of like the near-term challenges that we face as a species, things like peak oil and climate change
Hmm.
to some really cutting-edge areas like nanotechnology and genetic medicine and even the possibilities of space travel. I mean, it really does cover a lot.
Yeah, and it's not just like a list of predictions.
Right.
The author kind of kicks things off by making a really interesting observation about how technological progress throughout history has really like fundamentally reshaped our understanding of time and how the lines between past, present, and future, especially in the modern world, have really become so blurred. And he kind of makes the point that, if you were to go back just a few decades, some of the technology that we just completely take for granted today would have seemed like pure science fiction.
Yeah, that historical perspective is so
Yeah.
important. Yeah.
Yeah.
And while the author is very clear about, the inherent uncertainties in trying to predict the future with absolute certainty, I mean, it's a tough game to play,
Yeah.
predicting the next big trend with complete accuracy. But his central argument is that by carefully studying, current trends and potential technological breakthroughs, we can gain some really valuable insights.
Yeah.
More than that, we can even play a part in shaping a more desirable future, which is really exciting.
That's a nice optimistic take on things,
Yeah.
that it's not just all doom and gloom. Like there are things that we can do. So, which brings us to our mission today, tailored specifically for you, the learner, as we like to say. We are going to really delve into this material and try to pull out the most crucial insights. And we really want to explore how all of these future trends connect and really pinpoint the developments that are most likely to have a significant impact on our lives in the coming decades. And we want to do this in a way that gives you a clear, and detailed understanding of what's being talked about without overwhelming you. And I think a good place to start is with something that feels particularly relevant, especially right now, and that is peak oil and the potential depletion of our natural resources.
It's interesting. The author is very clear on this point that peak oil isn't about the world, suddenly running out of oil completely.
Right.
That will happen eventually. Oil is a finite resource, but the more immediate concern is reaching this point, this peak, where global oil production begins to decline,
Okay.
which he suggests is likely within the next 2 decades.
And it's almost impossible to overstate just how deeply ingrained oil is in modern industrialized societies.
Mhm.
Like everybody thinks about fueling our cars, and of course that's a huge part of it. I mean, in some countries, something like nearly 50% of all oil is used just for transportation. But then you have agriculture as well.
Right.
Oil is used in the production of pesticides. It's used to power the machinery for planting and harvesting, and then to transport that food across huge distances. And the book has this really, it's a simple statistic, but really sobering when you think about it. Since 2002, in many developed nations, producing every calorie of food, every single calorie of food has required about 10 calories of oil.
Wow.
So that kind of like blows my mind a little bit.
It really highlights the embedded nature of oil in our food systems, and its influence doesn't stop there.
Right.
So many of the products we use every day, from plastics and nylon to the tarmac on our roads, are derived from oil. The author points to some data from 2009, which paints a pretty stark picture.
Yeah.
Even back then, only 14 out of 54 oil-producing regions in the world were still increasing production. 30, a significant number, had already passed their peak.
Really?
And the remaining 10 were showing flat or declining output.
So not exactly an encouraging picture there. Now the book does mention that we might be able to extend our reliance on oil a little bit by tapping into what are considered unconventional oil sources.
That's right, yeah. Resources like oil sands and shale oil, those could potentially push back the timeline a little bit, maybe by another, say, 10 years or so. But even if we add, say, 50 years to the clock, on a longer time scale, that's a relatively short period for us to completely transition away from this really crucial resource.
Yeah. And the real pressure point isn't just when we finally do run out, but when global oil production starts to decrease and demand begins to exceed supply.
Right.
And that's when we're likely to see really significant supply disruptions and price increases like we saw during the energy crisis back in the 70s.
Exactly. And it seems like many experts were anticipating this to happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
The International Energy Agency, they issued a warning about this potential crunch way back in 2008.
Wow.
And Professor Sir David King, a very well-respected voice in the scientific community, thought demand would outstrip supply as early as 2014.
Yeah, there were a lot of people saying that 2014 was going to be the year.
And even a team from Kuwait University, using a revised model, they also pointed to 2014 as a likely peak.
So while the precise timing might be a subject of some debate, the underlying trend of declining conventional oil production within the next couple of decades seems pretty much like a given.
It seems very likely, yeah.
And the book also briefly touches upon other resource limitations that we're likely to face, like fresh water,
Yeah.
and other natural resources, and really starts to kind of paint this picture of a future where we may be facing increasingly constrained lifestyles if we don't adapt effectively.
Right, right.
So, which leads us perfectly to the second major challenge that's highlighted in the book, climate change, and it's presented right alongside peak oil as one of the most significant hurdles that humanity is going to face in the coming decades. And of course, it has direct consequences for those vital food and water supplies that we were just talking about.
Good point.
But even beyond that, it's also a major catalyst for many of the technological innovations that we're going to explore a little bit later.
That's right, yeah. And I think it's important to note that, while there are some aspects of climate change science that are still kind of being debated on the fringes, the overwhelming scientific consensus, as represented by the IPCC, is very clear. They state that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal, with an average global temperature increase of 0.74 degrees Celsius over the last century.
Right.
And the projections suggest a further rise of anywhere from 1.1 to a potentially concerning 6.4 degrees Celsius by the year 2100.
Right. That is a huge range.
It is, yeah.
But I mean, a few degrees might not sound like much, but the potential consequences could be quite dramatic, right?
It really could be, yeah.
The book mentions, increased rainfall in some areas, but also warmer and drier summers and more frequent droughts in others.
Right.
And the impact on agriculture is expected to be pretty severe.
Oh, absolutely. The International Rice Research Institute, for example, they suggest a potential 4 to 13% fall in rice yields.
Right.
And rice is the staple food for a huge portion of the world's population.
Yeah.
And yields for cereal crops are also likely to be affected, with Southern Europe potentially seeing a 20% decline with just a 2 degree Celsius rise.
Wow. So really, if we're talking about, potentially billions of people being affected by this, and I think a key aspect here is understanding the underlying cause,
Right.
what's actually driving climate change. And of course that's the increased concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
Right. And those gases are primarily carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide.
Okay. And the book kind of breaks down where those come from.
It does, yeah. Carbon dioxide is released primarily when we burn fossil fuels like oil, gas, coal, and wood.
Right.
It's also a byproduct of cement production, which is kind of interesting.
Really?
Yeah. Methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas, comes from the production of fossil fuels as well.
Okay.
But also from landfills and livestock.
Oh, okay.
And then nitrous oxide is linked to the burning of fossil fuels as well as the use of fertilizers. The author also points to a really significant contributor that's often overlooked, and that's deforestation, which accounts for around 25% of all carbon dioxide emissions.
So that's a huge chunk.
It is.
Yeah. So really, we're not just releasing more of these heat trapping gases into the atmosphere.
Right.
We're also reducing the natural systems that help absorb them.
Exactly. Double whammy.
So it's a bit of a 1-2 punch.
Yeah.
And the book also touches on what we might need to do to address this. It mentions the Stern Review, for example.
Yeah, the Stern Review, which proposed a very significant reduction in carbon emissions from power generation, something in the range of 60 to 75% by 2050
Right.
to stabilize greenhouse gas levels. And even if we take, really significant action now, the book reminds us that climate change is going to continue to have effects for decades to come.
Yeah.
The costs associated with climate change related emergencies are already rising.
Right. And it gave some pretty sobering examples, like the cost of severe winter weather in the UK.
Right.
They say that it costs somewhere between 230 and 600 million pounds per day.
Right.
And the increasing likelihood of major weather events similar to Hurricane Katrina and the Australian floods, it really makes you think about how industries like insurance are going to have to completely rethink their business models.
Absolutely. The very concept of all risks insurance might just become, unsustainable.
Yeah.
And we might need to move towards more specific policies for different types of risks.
Right, right. And then, of course, the increasing need for spending on things like flood defenses and coastal erosion, which the book says, could reach £1 billion per year in the UK alone,
Right.
really raises some complex political questions about, which areas to protect and which might be, deemed too expensive to save.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
Very difficult decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's not all doom and gloom.
Right.
The book does offer a glimpse of some potentially radical solutions, like geoengineering, for example.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting to note the sheer scale of some of these proposed solutions, like, the concept of giant solar sails in orbit,
Yeah.
made from incredibly thin materials
Mhm.
designed to basically shade the Earth and reduce the amount of solar radiation that we receive.
So like a giant sun umbrella.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, it sounds like science fiction, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
But the author points out that with advancements in nanotechnology, constructing such sails in space, perhaps even using, materials mined from the moon or asteroids might actually become, a viable option.
Wow. So I mean that sounds really outlandish now, but I guess the thinking is that compared to trying to get, billions of people to drastically alter their lifestyles and reduce consumption,
Right.
that might actually be, seen as a more practical approach.
Right. Exactly, yeah.
So, we've talked about, oil, we've talked about climate change.
Right.
And that brings us to another really critical resource, and that's water.
Water, yeah.
And specifically peak water. And the book makes it clear that this isn't some kind of global simultaneous event, but that different regions are going to experience what they're calling local peak water at
Yeah.
different times.
That's a crucial distinction. The UN is already reporting that 700 million people in 43 countries are facing water scarcity.
Wow.
And that's primarily in Africa and South Asia currently.
Right.
But it's also increasingly affecting parts of China and even Europe. And a really crucial point to understand here is the distribution of Earth's water.
Yeah.
97% of it is salt water, and most of the fresh water is locked up in polar ice caps or inaccessible underground.
Right.
Only a tiny fraction of the total water on Earth is readily available in lakes and rivers and rainfall. And even that is unevenly distributed across the globe.
And of course, our consumption of that very limited fresh water has really skyrocketed over the last century.
It really has.
I mean, the book mentions that in the 20th century alone, freshwater consumption increased ninefold.
Ninefold, yeah.
That's just mind-boggling. And we're now estimated to be tapping almost half of all renewable freshwater resources.
Right.
And if we continue along this path, the potential for really serious damage to ecosystems is very real, which could, in turn have, negative consequences for us as well. So while the domestic water supply in developed countries might feel relatively secure for now,
Right.
the real concern, as the book points out, is water for food production, which accounts for a massive 70% of human consumption.
It does, yeah. And And it takes a tremendous amount of water to grow our food,
Yeah.
especially our staple crops
Mm.
like grain and rice.
Right.
The book provides some really concerning examples of what happens when water resources are overused.
Yeah.
The case of the Hai River Basin in China is particularly stark.
Yeah.
Overpumping there is leading to a projected 40 billion ton annual shortfall of water
Wow.
and a 40 million ton reduction in the grain harvest,
Jeez.
which is enough to feed, 120 million people.
Yeah. So I mean, so we're really talking about potential famine, potential starvation on a massive scale.
Absolutely, yeah. And more broadly across China,
Mm-hmm.
wheat and grain production actually peaked back in 1997, partly due to these water shortages.
Right.
And this has implications not just for China, but also for regions like Europe that rely on food imports from water-stressed nations.
Yeah. So this is a truly global issue.
It is, yeah.
And it seems like unlike oil, where we're actively exploring and developing alternatives,
Right.
the options for fresh water are much more limited.
Right.
Desalination is mentioned, but it's currently incredibly expensive.
It is, yeah. It's energy intensive and costly. But the book does offer a glimmer of hope here, suggesting that advancements in nanotechnology might make desalination a more cost-effective solution in the future. So
Yeah.
while we might not have these easy substitutes for water like we're hoping to find for oil,
Right.
technology could still play a really important role in expanding our access to it.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we've talked about, peak oil, we've talked about climate change, we've talked about peak water.
Yeah.
And the book kind of goes on to outline some other, significant threats to our future food security. It really paints a pretty complex picture of all the different forces that are coming to bear on this.
It does,
Big
absolutely. You have population expansion,
Right.
which means that we need to produce more food
Right.
from the same or even less land.
Right.
And then there's the increasing meat consumption in industrialized nations,
Right.
which puts a much greater strain on agricultural resources compared to plant-based diets.
Yeah.
And then declining fish stocks.
Right.
The growth of non-food agriculture for biofuels and petroleum substitutes.
Right.
And then the declining productivity of some agricultural land.
Right. So all these factors kind of coming together to impact our ability to feed a growing global population.
Exactly.
But it's not all negative, is it?
No.
I mean, the book dedicates a significant portion to potential solutions and innovations that could help us navigate these challenges.
It does, yeah.
And I guess a good place to start is with something that feels very relevant to us today, and that is cloud computing.
Yeah, cloud computing. It's interesting to note how something that seems kind of abstract, like cloud computing,
Right.
can actually have some really tangible benefits in addressing resource depletion.
Yeah.
By enabling, digital communication and trade, it reduces the need for us to physically travel and transport goods, which means less reliance on oil.
Right. So it's a form of dematerialization, as the author might say.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dematerialization.
And then, of course, there's a more direct approach to food production.
Right. And that brings us to urban farming and specifically, the concept of vertical farms, which is something that really sparks the imagination.
It does. Vertical farms. These are multi-story buildings designed for growing crops and even raising animals in urban environments.
Right.
And they offer a really compelling vision of kind of localized, food production. The idea is to make cities more self-sufficient in their food supply. And while it might sound very futuristic, the book actually highlights Dr. Dixon Despommier as a key figure who's been, developing these ideas for decades now.
Yeah. And the potential seems enormous.
It does.
I mean, the book suggests that you can theoretically grow almost any kind of crop in a vertical farm, not just, your typical indoor produce like tomatoes and lettuce, but also staples like wheat, rice, and corn.
Right.
And they could even potentially raise, poultry and fish.
Yeah.
Though, maybe not larger livestock.
Right. But I mean, still a pretty amazing concept. And one of the really key aspects here is this idea of controlled production, right?
Absolutely.
Closer proximity to consumers and a significant reduction in the reliance on both petroleum for transportation and fresh water for irrigation.
Right.
The book also mentions the possibility of self-sufficiency in terms of energy, using things like rooftop wind turbines and solar power
Yeah.
and even, the potential for capturing and redirecting sunlight within these buildings to maximize, plant growth.
Exactly.
And it's not just about, efficiency either.
Yeah.
There's a potential environmental upside as well.
There is. Yeah.
Right. If we can move a significant portion of agriculture into cities, it could potentially free up land for ecosystem restoration.
Right. Lessening the pressure on traditional agricultural land, we could potentially see a reversal of some of the biodiversity loss that's been associated with, large-scale farming.
So now we've moved from food to manufacturing.
Right.
And that brings us to another technology that's presented as really transformative, and that is 3D printing, or as it's often called additive manufacturing.
Yeah, 3D printing. It's interesting to consider the shift from mass production to a more on-demand, localized model.
Right.
That 3D printing really enables, and the book gives this great example of the Irby hybrid vehicle,
Yeah.
where 3D printing was used to create all of the parts
Right.
for a working prototype. And it allows for rapid prototyping, faster time to market, and the potential for a significant reduction in waste,
Yeah.
by manufacturing only what's needed.
Yeah, and it's not just for prototypes anymore either, right?
No, it's not.
The book says that something like 40% of 3D printed outputs are now final products. So it's really, really becoming more and more mainstream. And this idea of what they call digital transportation
Mm.
of designs with local production bureaus or even, home 3D printers could really, really revolutionize, supply chains and how we think about getting the products that we use.
Absolutely. Imagine being able to, download the design for a spare part,
Right.
that and just print it at home
Yeah.
rather than having to order it and wait for it to be shipped. This has huge implications for reducing the need for large inventories
Right.
and the environmental impact of transportation.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And the book even mentions, NASA and the US Army exploring 3D printing for applications in space and on the battlefield.
Yeah.
We're getting spare parts quickly is absolutely crucial.
Slow.
And coupled with 3D scanners, the potential for repairing broken items, instead of discarding them entirely becomes much more feasible, which aligns really well with the need to conserve resources, right?
It does, exactly. It's a move away from the kind of disposable culture that we've become accustomed to,
Right.
and towards one of repair and reuse, facilitated by this ability to digitally replicate, almost any component.
Yeah. So now let's move on to nanotechnology,
Nanotechnology, yeah.
which the book suggests, might have the widest future potential of all the technologies that it discusses.
It's amazing. It's interesting to note how incredibly broad its applicability is. It seems to touch almost every sector imaginable, from aerospace and agriculture to medicine and energy.
Mhm.
It's about manipulating matter at the nanoscale to create things that are stronger, lighter, cheaper, faster, more energy efficient, more environmentally friendly. The book mentions that the market for nanotechnology enabled products was already estimated at $1 trillion in 2011.
Wow.
And it highlights its role in things like microchips, thinner screens, better sunscreens. But the real revolution is still to come.
Right. And the book discusses, potential future applications like nanoelectronics, beyond the limits of current silicon-based technology.
Right.
New nanomaterials, nanocoatings, and even, the potential for nanomedicine.
Absolutely.
And importantly, nanotechnology also offers potential solutions to some of the big challenges that we talked about earlier, like climate change, through things like those vast solar sails or the potential for space elevators built with carbon nanotubes.
Yeah.
Even something like water purification could be revolutionized by nanofiltration techniques.
Right. Yeah.
Sure
It's
is.
it's mind-boggling to think about, manipulating matter at that level.
It really is, yeah. And shifting gears a little bit, let's delve into the world of genetic modification and synthetic biology. This feels like an area with huge potential, but also some significant considerations.
It does, and it's interesting the distinction that the book makes between genetic modification, or GM,
Right.
and the more kind of radical synthetic biology.
Okay.
GM is about altering, existing life, while synthetic biology is about essentially reprogramming organisms for entirely new functions. And the book gives this great analogy. It's like modifying an acorn to grow a better oak tree
Hmm.
versus reprogramming it to grow directly into a bio building.
That's a really good analogy.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Um, that really clarifies the difference. And of course, GM of crops has been around for a while with the aim of increasing yields and disease resistance,
Right.
and potentially reducing the need for pesticides.
Right.
And then there's GM of animals, like the Aqua Advantage salmon, which grows to market size much faster than conventional salmon.
That's right.
And the book also discusses future quote unquote biotech factories,
Mhm.
using GM microorganisms to produce, a whole range of different products from insulin and biofuels to bioplastics and even, chemicals for oil spill cleanup.
Right, right.
So really kind of tackling a lot of different problems, and synthetic biology kind of takes this even further with companies working on things like producing bioacrylic from cellulose or synthetic rubber from non-petrochemical sources, which could be huge in addressing our reliance on petroleum. Now to kind of address the challenges posed by peak oil and
Yeah.
climate change in transportation, electric vehicles or
Oh,
EVs
yes.
are presented as really kind of a crucial part of the solution.
Absolutely, yeah. The transition away from petroleum fueled vehicles is deemed necessary.
Yeah,
The book highlights the energy efficiency of EVs, especially in traffic, and the fact that they have far fewer moving parts,
right.
potentially leading to greater reliability and less maintenance. And of course, there's the issue of what they call range anxiety, how far an EV can travel on a single charge.
Right.
But the author discusses, innovations like lightweight composites, advanced batteries, including, the potential use of graphene for faster charging,
Okay.
and even, battery swap systems as ways to kind of address this.
Yeah. And it's not just cars either.